When someone asks you who discovered America, chances are you immediately think of Christopher Columbus. But here's something that might surprise you. Columbus wasn't the first person to set foot on American soil. In fact, the story of who truly discovered America is far more complex and fascinating than most people realize. Today, we're going to explore the real story behind America's discovery. We'll examine the evidence for pre-Columbian visitors, uncover why our continents are called America instead of Columbia, and learn about the Spanish treasure hunters who changed the course of history. By the end of this video, you'll have a completely different perspective on one of history's most famous questions: the Asian connection. Let's start with the most important fact. The very first people to discover America weren't European at all. Thousands of years before any European ship crossed the Atlantic, the ancestors of Native Americans had already made the journey from Asia. These brave souls crossed the Bering land bridge during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower and a strip of land connected Asia to North America. These early Americans spread across both continents, establishing sophisticated civilizations like the Maya, Aztec, and Inca empires. They built magnificent cities, developed complex agricultural systems, and created remarkable works of art and engineering. When Europeans finally arrived, they found a land already rich with human culture and achievement. But what about European explorers? Were there any who reached America before Columbus? Legends and mysteries. Over the centuries, numerous stories have emerged about early European explorers reaching America. Some of these tales are quite extraordinary. There's the story of Ho Chi Minh, a Buddhist monk who supposedly sailed from China to Mexico in 459 AD. But there's compelling evidence for Polynesian voyagers reaching South America by 1200 AD. How do we know? Sweet potatoes, an American crop, spread to Polynesia before Columbus ever sailed, and Native American DNA appears in Rapa Nui populations. Recent studies from 2020 have confirmed this remarkable Pacific connection. One of the most intriguing European stories involves a Welsh prince named Madoc. According to legend, he landed on the shores of what is now Alabama in 1170 and left behind traces of the Welsh language among local Native American tribes. In 1953, a plaque was even erected at Mobile Bay commemorating his supposed arrival. But here's the thing about legends. They're often based on wishful thinking rather than solid evidence. For centuries, these stories remain just that: stories. However, there's one group of early explorers whose claims have been backed up by real archaeological evidence: the Vikings. The Vikings were seafaring warriors and explorers from Scandinavia who were famous for their long ships and their fearless attitude toward the open ocean. Their oral traditions, preserved in epic poems called sagas, told stories of voyages to distant lands across the Western Sea. The major clues were contained in two Icelandic epic poems, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Both poems derive from oral tradition, but were written down in the 13th century, about 200 years after the events they describe took place. These sagas told the story of Leif Erikson, known as Lucky Leif, who sailed from Greenland to the eastern coast of North America around the year 1000 AD. When he discovered wild grapes growing there, he named the place Vinland the Good. Other Vikings followed Leif to establish settlements in this new land. For centuries, these sagas were dismissed as mere mythology. Then in the 1960s, everything changed. Archaeologists discovered the remains of Viking settlements in Newfoundland, Canada, at a site called L'Anse aux Meadows. The evidence was unmistakable. They found iron nails, spindle whorls for spinning thread, and the foundations of buildings constructed in typical Viking style. L'Anse aux Meadows is the first and only known site established by Vikings in North America and the earliest evidence of European settlement in the New World. This was groundbreaking because Native Americans didn't work with iron before European contact. The Viking settlement proved that Europeans had indeed reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. However, this was a seasonal camp, not a permanent colony. Conflicts with native tribes, whom the Vikings called Skrælingjar, and Greenland's isolation forced abandonment within 30 years. The Viking colonies didn't last long, and eventually they returned to Greenland. Why America instead of Columbia? Now here's a question that puzzles many people. If Columbus was the most famous explorer to reach America, Why isn't our continent named after him? The answer lies in a case of mistaken identity and brilliant marketing. Columbus died believing he had reached the eastern edges of Asia. He never realized he had discovered an entirely new continent. This is where another Italian explorer enters our story. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian explorer, financier, navigator, and cartographer who made several voyages to South America in the late 1490s. Unlike Columbus, Vespucci realized something crucial. These lands were not part of Asia's eastern outskirts as initially thought, but an entirely new continent. In a letter to Florence, Vespucci called South America the New World. His letters describing these voyages were widely circulated and read throughout Europe. A German scholar named Martin Waldseemüller read Vespucci's letters and was convinced that this Italian explorer was correct. These lands were indeed a new continent, separate from Asia. In a text that accompanied the 1507 Waldseemüller map, the two men explained exactly why they named the new continent, which is modern-day South America, after Vespucci. To honor Vespucci, Waldseemüller decided to name the new continent America, using the feminine form of Amerigo's first name, following the pattern of other continents which had female names. Waldseemüller's 1507 map went viral via printing presses, cementing the name. By the time Columbus's true achievements were better understood, the name America had already stuck. The Spanish conquistadors. While the Vikings made the first documented European contact with America, it was the Spanish who began the lasting European occupation of the continent. When Columbus returned to Spain, he brought back something that would change everything: gold jewelry. But Spain's real advantage was invisible. Diseases like smallpox that killed approximately 90% of native people within decades, collapsing entire societies before battles even began. The sight of that gold sparked what can only be described as treasure fever. Within 50 years of Columbus's return, thousands of Spanish adventurers known as conquistadors had crossed the Atlantic in search of precious metals and riches. The most famous of these conquistadors was Hernán Cortés, who conquered the mighty Aztec Empire in the 1520s. The Aztecs were a sophisticated civilization that had built magnificent cities in what is now Mexico. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was larger than any European city of the time. Yet Cortés and his small army managed to defeat them, largely due to superior weapons, horses, and devastating diseases brought from Europe. In the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro accomplished a similar feat in South America, conquering the wealthy Inca Empire in Peru. The amount of gold and silver that flowed back to Spain from these conquests was staggering. It literally changed the global economy. The Spanish conquest wasn't limited to Central and South America. Between 1539 and 1542, two separate expeditions explored much of what is now the southern United States. Hernando de Soto landed in Florida and led his men westward, becoming the first Europeans to see the Mississippi River. His expedition traveled as far as Texas and Oklahoma before returning. Meanwhile, Francisco Coronado traveled north from Mexico, searching for the legendary 7 Cities of Gold. Though he never found these mythical cities, his expedition became the first European group to see the Grand Canyon and traveled as far east as Kansas. One of the most colorful stories from this period involves Juan Ponce de Leon, who had come to the New World with Columbus himself. Native Americans in Puerto Rico told him about a land to the north that contained not just gold, but something even more valuable: a fountain whose waters granted eternal youth to anyone who drank from them. In 1513, Ponce de Leon set off to find this fountain of youth. He landed in what is now Florida and spent months sailing around its coast, searching for the magical waters. He never found the fountain, but he did claim Florida for Spain in 1513. Though Ponce de Leon died in 1521, his discovery of Florida would prove significant for Spanish expansion. More than 50 years later, in 1565, Spanish Admiral Pedro Menéndez de Avilés founded St. Augustine, the oldest continuous European settlement in the modern United States. Other European powers joined the race. Spain's incredible wealth from the New World made other European nations extremely jealous. They wanted their share of these riches and began sending their own explorers across the Atlantic. England entered the race in 1497 when King Henry VII hired John Cabot, an Italian seaman, to explore the new lands and search for a passage to Asia. Cabot sailed much farther north than Columbus had, eventually reaching the rocky shores of Newfoundland. At first, he thought he had reached China, but on a second voyage, he sailed south along the North American coast as far as Chesapeake Bay. Though Cabot found no gold and no passage to Asia, his voyages were valuable for England. In later years, English governments used Cabot's explorations to justify their claims to most of the eastern coast of North America. France also joined the exploration game. In 1524, King Francis I sent Giovanni da Verrazzano to find gold and a sea route to Asia. Verrazzano sailed along the entire eastern coast of America, and during his voyage, he anchored his ship in what is now New York Harbor. Today, the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, one of New York City's most impressive landmarks, bears his name. 10 years later, another French explorer named Jacques Cartier discovered the St. Lawrence River. He reported back to France that the forests along the river were full of fur-bearing animals, and the waters were teeming with fish. On a second voyage, he sailed further upriver to the site of present-day Montreal. Though Jacques Cartier didn't find the passage to Asia he was looking for, his explorations gave France a claim to what would eventually become Canada, the challenge of settlement. By the early 1600s, claiming territory in the New World was one thing, but actually settling it was quite another. Europeans could only truly make these lands their own by establishing permanent communities of their own people. Fortunately for European powers, by the 17th century, plenty of people were ready to make the dangerous journey across the Atlantic. Some came seeking wealth and opportunity. Others were fleeing religious persecution or political troubles in their home countries. Some were simply looking for a fresh start in a new world. The 100 years after 1600 saw the establishment of numerous European colonies throughout North America. The English established Jamestown in Virginia, the Pilgrims founded Plymouth in Massachusetts, and the Dutch created New Amsterdam, which would later become New York City. The French established Quebec, and the Spanish continued to expand their settlements in Florida and the Southwest. Each of these colonies had its own character, its own challenges, and its own relationship with the Native American peoples who were already living there. The story of how these settlements developed and eventually became the United States is a fascinating tale in itself. So, who really discovered America? The answer depends on how you define discovery. If we're talking about the first humans to set foot on American soil, that honor belongs to the Asian ancestors of Native Americans, who arrived thousands of years before any European explorer. If we're talking about the first Europeans to reach America, the Vikings deserve that recognition, with solid archaeological evidence backing up their claims. But if we're talking about the European contact that led to permanent settlement and lasting historical change, then Columbus and the Spanish conquistadors who followed him were the ones who truly connected the old world and the new. Columbus didn't find an empty continent, he ignited the Columbian Exchange, reshaping the globe through disease, crops, and colonization. The story of America's discovery isn't about one person or one voyage. It's about multiple waves of human migration, exploration, and settlement spanning thousands of years. Each group of people who arrived brought their own cultures, technologies, and dreams, contributing to the rich and complex history of the Americas. What's most important to remember is that when Europeans arrived, they didn't find an empty wilderness. They found a land already full of sophisticated civilizations, each with their own remarkable achievements and stories to tell.